Hi, everybody. Very nice to be here. Welcome to all of you. My name is Peter Jackson, and I'm here at the University of Glasgow, and in my capacity as Director of the Scottish Council on Global Affairs. And you're all very welcome on both counts. This is a fantastic conference, and I'm so pleased to be able to be part of it. Thank you to Jay and all of the other organizers and administrative support for doing this. It's, I think, going to be a brilliant couple of days. So I will now, without any further talk, introduce the participants of this first panel. And I think what we're going to do is we're going to, if that's okay with Darragh, who's participating remotely, this is a true hybrid panel. We're going to have one remote speaker, two in-person speakers, and one remote commentator. So I thought that it was a good idea, wasn't my idea, to be fair, to sandwich the remote participation with the in-person participation. And so I think we're going to begin with Darragh Gannon, who is currently a Fulbright Irish scholar at Georgetown University, who has published widely on the transnational experiences of modern Irish history, especially the period of the Irish Revolution. His publications include Proclaiming a Republic, Ireland, 1916 in the National Collection, Ireland, 1922, Independence, Partition and Civil War, with Fergal McGarry, and Conflict, Diaspora and Empire, Irish Nationalism in Britain, 1912 to 1922. He's now working on a book, Worlds of Revolution, Ireland's Global Moment, 1919 to 1923. We're very pleased to have you as a participant, Darragh, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that very kind introduction. Can I just do a quick check that everyone can hear us okay? Yes, heads are nodding. Excellent. I'm delighted to be here virtually, and I should say that I'm joined by my colleague Arie Dubnov from George Washington University. We will be co-delivering this presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully, I think the screen sharing has been disabled for the moment. Okay, well, we can begin in any event, and hopefully that will be rectified momentarily. So again, thanks to Peter for the kind introduction, and thanks to Jay for the invitation to contribute. It's good to see so many friends and familiar faces on the conference program. I am aware that though Arie and I are partitioned from you via Zoom, we are looking forward to reconnecting with you all at a subsequent workshop. So to begin, writing in 1907, amid the debates concerning Irish Home Rule, the Irish-born playwright George Bernard Shaw used a preface to one of his plays to warn the British regarding their visions for the future of empire. Quote, "Now for England's share of warning, let her look at the empire, for unless she makes it such a federation for civil strength and defense that all peoples will cling to it voluntarily, it will inevitably become a military tyranny to prevent them from abandoning it. And such a tyranny will drain the English taxpayer of his money more effectively than its worst qualities can ever drain its victims of their liberty." He reiterated the point again in 1912, quote, "The future is not to the empires, but to federations of self-governing nations, exactly as within these nations, the future is not to capitalist oligarchies, but to collectivist organizations on free and equal citizens. In short, to commonwealths." Thank you, Neil, for sorting out our PowerPoint, much appreciated. Now, the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 did not satisfy as much as further frustrate the famous Anglo-Irish playwright. Though Ireland was finally acknowledged as a separate nation, given self-governance in the form of a parliament in Dublin, it was also given status as a dominion and admitted into the British Commonwealth. It was further expected to remain faithful to King George V and his successors, and to accommodate the extant partition of Ireland, including the Protestant population and militias of the new Northern Ireland. Ulster, which was the name of the Protestant province with its unionist majority, became, for Bernard Shaw, a symbol of continual British domination through new means. Accordingly, in 1936, when he sought to comment on the situation in Palestine that dipped into violence, he wrote another play, offering a fictional dramatization of Arthur Balfour's conversation with the Zionist leader Chaim Weizmann, culminating in the 1917 Balfour Declaration. The short play concluded with the decisive verdict, quote, "Another Ulster, as if one were not enough," unquote. So we can just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. Now, among the legacies of the British Empire, we can find a triangle of sadness that connects the partitions of Ireland, India, Pakistan, and Palestine. Numerous studies have examined Irish networks and ties with India, both at the level of imperial control and through solidarity and bonds of anti-colonial actors. Thanks to that historiography, we know that Irish and Indian leaders learned from each other and were inspired by each other. Next slide, please. Further, in public gestures and expressions of solidarity today, the link between the Irish Catholic struggle against Britain and the Palestinian struggle against the Israeli colonial tactics is often made as well, as can be seen from the photos of murals at Belfast's famous peace walls separating Protestant and Catholic neighbourhoods in that divided city. And this, of course, is an illustration or illumination of what Glenda Sluga adverted to earlier in terms of the sub-partitions of partition. However, much less attention was given to the other diagonal line in the triangle, connecting Ireland to Palestine in the 1920s and 1930s, at the very time that partition was born. Our aim in this paper is to shed light on the hitherto understudied and surprising links between events in Ireland and policies and developments taking place in Palestine, not only to the Arab Palestinian side, but also in terms of the Jewish Zionist camp. Our talk, in other words, is also part of a broader attempt to revisit and indeed scrutinize what can be called the Harp and the Star of David nexus, to put those in translocal and imperial contexts, and perhaps to reflect critically on the way that historical analogies are constructed and continue to function. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, these maps will be, of course, very familiar to you, representing the partition of Ireland and the proposed partition of Palestine. So just some background information to kind of bring everyone up to speed. The partition of Ireland was effected in 1921 under the provisions of the Government of Ireland Act 1 year earlier. Under this legislation, 6 counties of the province of Ulster, with an overall Protestant majority, remain within the United Kingdom, so effectively creating 2 ethno-national states, Catholic Southern Ireland, or the Irish Free State, and the Protestant-dominated Northern Ireland. The 1925 Boundary Commission would reinforce borders between North and South. Moving to Palestine, formerly part of the Ottoman Empire, Palestine was separated from Syria in 1920 under British rule. Britain, of course, was granted a mandate over Palestine under first the San Reno Conference, and then this was enshrined at the Treaty of Sèvres, both in 1920. 15 years later, the British Peel Commission proposed the partition of Palestine into 3 zones: Jewish state, an Arab state, and a neutral state. Now, while these maps, of course, are familiar to you, I would encourage you to think beyond the contours of these established boundaries. We, I think, need to be aware of what Benedict Anderson termed the powers of the map as logo. The idea that these images are imprinted in our public and collective consciousness as the only version or variation of partition which exists. Indeed, Anderson would suggest that not only nation states, but imperial polities would consciously reprint maps to, again, further embed their power over communities at a high political level. And in this regard, as we move on to the next slide, I would like us to think of, in the context of Ireland, alternative Ulsters. As I've written and published elsewhere, this term alternative Ulsters hopefully captures the zeitgeist of this moment of experimentation, in which partition, as has been alluded to earlier, was a new tool, effectively, in the toolbox of empires. And at first, I should point out that this jigsaw, contemporaneous to the period we're looking at, I think reflects the more complicated version of partition, which many contemporaries would have experienced. And this is from the Ulster Museum. So actually, we're going to begin in continental Europe in terms of our analogy. And I'm very struck by what Dirk Moses has written about the importance of the experience of partition in continental Europe to the example of Ireland, or to the idea of Ireland as a partition as travelogue. Moses argues, quote, if the British Empire's motivations in considering partition were to control the outcome of the Irish and indeed later partitions, then the context of continental Europe, European imperial breakup after the First World War is indeed relevant, in part because the British co-designed the post-war architecture, unquote. Now, we can look at the so-called minority treaties which emerged from the Paris Peace Conference in contradistinction to the partition which emerged in Ireland as part of this attempt at an intellectual history of partition, as opposed to an institutional or indeed illegal analysis of partition in Ireland. And I'm struck again by this concept of the laboratories of sovereignty, first coined by Leonard Smith in terms of the Paris Peace Conference, in which he argued that the provisions of those treaties in 1919 and 1920, dealing with things like minorities, partitions, and state building, were part of a laboratory, an experiment. So again, look at some of those provisions in continental Europe in contradistinction to those provided for in Northern Ireland. The Saar region, contested between France and Germany, was subject to a plebiscite 15 years after the Paris Peace Conference, wherein ultimately those in the Saar region decided to rejoin Germany. No such provision was accounted for the Catholic-dominated counties of Fermanagh and Tyrone. In Poland, minority rights were guaranteed in principle by the League of Nations. Again, no such provisions were enacted under the partition of Ireland. And thirdly, and perhaps most evocatively, we can look at the city of Gdansk or Danzig, which had a majority German population, which of course was inscribed the status of a free city or a freie Stadt under the League of Nations protection in 1920. And to look at a comparative angle here, the city of Derry, which had a majority Catholic population of about 56% per the 1926 census, was however, locked into the Protestant and Unionist dominated polity of Northern Ireland. And I think it's something of a historic irony that 50 years after the enshrinement of partition in Northern Ireland, that the Catholic residents of Derry at the height of the Troubles would self-proclaim their part of the city as Free Derry, almost in a kind of an ideological or intellectual dialectic with the diktats of the British state. So partition in Northern Ireland, in contradistinction to the experiments and the liberal approaches to minorities and state building in continental Europe, was determined by imperial policymakers, often without serious or sustained consultation with stakeholders, most notably the Catholic minority. And I think it's quite apt that Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, when observing the absence of international intervention in the case of Ireland, would describe the Irish question in 1919 as, quote, the great metaphysical tragedy of the day, unquote. So we're just going to move on to the next slide, please. Now, I would like to argue, secondly, that Irish nationalists contemporaneously were very well aware and very well versed in the idea of the partition machine, as you can see from some of these quotes from newspapers. Old Ireland in July 1920 stated, the Punjab, Palestine, Ulster, the plan is the same in each. And you would see commentary in Irish nationalist papers about Palestine, about India and other partitions, basically every second day between 1919 and 1923, reinforcing this idea of partition as transnational moment. We can see in these quotes the rejection of Irish nationalists that the idea of partition as a legitimate tool of imperial policyholders and an attempt to legitimize European mandatory rule over the Eastern Mediterranean. And in some of these quotes, they are very much critiquing the idea or precept of empire and civilization as part of the liberal New World Order, rather seeing it as a continuation of imperial policies, in this case, by the British state. So we'll just move on to the next slide, please. So, of course, as we discussed, violence underpinned not only the extant experience of anti-colonial activists, but also the ideas of policymakers furthermore. And I think Irish nationalists' recurrent responses to the idea of partition in Palestine and the Middle East more broadly was in part framed by an uncomfortable reality that the name or experience of Ireland was connected with the imperial project, certainly in the Middle East. The idea of policing Palestine was in some respects coterminous with the name of Ireland during this period. And it's framed quite neatly by the period 1917 to 1922. So, for example, in 1917, the 10th Division of the British Army 10th Irish Division, excuse me, fought in the Third Battle of Gaza against the Turkish forces in southern Palestine. And ostensibly, the 10th Irish Division would become the executor of the British state in that regard. And of course, they had been formed at the behest of Lord Kitchener, Secretary of State for War, earlier in the conflict. Later in this period, in April 1922, we see veterans of the Royal Irish Constabulary deployed to Palestine to form part of the Palestine Gendarmerie at the behest of Winston Churchill, Secretary of State for the Colonies. Indeed, it's been estimated that 85% of the force were former Black and Tans or auxiliaries who had, of course, seen action notoriously in the Irish War of Independence, and again, were coterminous with acts of brutality, violence on behalf of the empire in Ireland. And at this point, I'm going to pass the virtual microphone over to my colleague, Arie Dubnov, who will take it from there.
Thank you so much, Darragh. I hope you can all hear me. And again, apologies for not joining in person. So I'll take it right from here. So as we've heard, it was exactly in this context of anti-colonial violence and a very brutal counterinsurgency that two crucial things happened quite simultaneously. First, as we've heard, the personnel involved in crushing the Irish rebellion came to Palestine. And of course, that was, as you've just heard, Churchill's brainchild, and they inaugurated an Irish involvement in Palestine's policing. But no wonder then, as some historians already commented before us, that many of these men and their commanders, and including British civil servants in Palestine, thought of Palestine as an Oriental Ireland. Second, it was in that context that the idea of partition came to Palestine. In response to the Arab revolt of 1936, the British government appointed a commission of inquiry headed by Lord Peel to assess the causes of the Arab riots and the performance of the British Mandate government. And it was this commission that went beyond its declared mandate, first proposed the partition of Palestine, the map you've seen earlier on. Now, I would like to mention that it was not only British civil servants and military commanders who thought of Palestine as an Oriental Ireland, but also local actors who began drawing parallel lines showing resemblance between British methods of control in Ireland and Palestine, even more so finding inspiration in the Irish Revolt and seeing it as a model or a template for their own political action. This was not an easy or tension-free move for many of those Zionists. In 1916, for instance, during the Easter Rising, most Zionist leaders were still busy fighting the Ottomans and not to make any bold statement that might antagonize the British, who were still busy fighting the Ottomans and conquering the land. that included even, as it might sound surprising for us today, the hawkish right wing of Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was then obsessed with building up the Jewish Legion, the unofficial but popular name that was given to the 5 battalions of Jewish volunteers that joined the British Army. Who, in his vision, would serve as a cement bonding the Zionists and the British imperial interests together. And in an article that the young Jabotinsky sent to a Russian newspaper called Russkaya Vedomosti, it was closed by the Bolsheviks in 1917, Jabotinsky expressed empathy for the Irish cause, but not sympathy with the methods of struggle employed by the Irish rebels, who were condemned by him for pursuing an impossible cause, a war of liberation that could only lead to a senseless sacrifice of many. However, by the late 1920s, Jabotinsky's movement was undergoing radicalization. As the young Russian Jewish essayist and activist Abba Achimeir pushed Jabotinsky to endorse bolder positions. Achimeir, who is sometimes described as the founder of the maximalist faction of the Zionist revisionist movement, was first drawn to Bolshevik revolutionary methods and soon became a great admirer of the Italian fascism, openly calling himself a Hebrew fascist in a series of controversial newspapers columns. In 1927, that is a decade before Lord Peel's commission even set foot in Palestine, he wrote in favor of the Sinn Féin, going as far as to argue that the very name of the Irish movement, which literally means we ourselves, is not only the best summary to describe the preferable Zionist policy, but also that should detach itself from the British Empire, but is much better attuned with the spirit of assertive Jewishness that expressed itself in a famous rabbinic proverb by Hillel the Elder, who argued, Im ein ani li mili, which literally means, if I am not for myself, then who will be for me? His equally hawkish comrade Yeshua Heschel Yevin concurred and wrote that the British prison in Akko, where members of both Palestinian and Jewish underground groups were jailed, was a second cork, adding that with rage against the Zionists who did collaborate with the British authorities, if only the Jewish people knew what all other nations know, how to eradicate internal treason, again with a hint to the Irish methods. After the partition plan was put forward in 1937, this trickle of analogies turned into a flood. The most conspicuous examples come from the extremist fighters of the Lehi, the acronym of Lochamei Cherut Israel, the militant anti-British underground group established in 1940 by Avraham Yair Stern, who rejected the idea that military struggle against the British forces should be postponed due to the war against Nazi Germany. They found inspiration in the IRA as well. In 1941, not long before he was killed by the British police, Yair Stern began translating into Hebrew Patrick O'Haggerty's book on the victory of the Sinn Féin, telling the story of the 1916 Easter Rebellion. And the opening chapter was published in Hebrew in Ba'Machteret, the Underground, the Lehi's newspaper. The main lessons to be drawn from the chapter was that although the Easter Rising failed to accomplish its declared mission, the Irish struggle gained new martyrs whose memory perpetuated the next rebellions. And shortly after that, in February 1942, Stern was captured and killed by the British police, and he turned himself in sort of a Zionist Che Guevara, an iconic martyr of the movement. Similarly, the Polish Jewish Lehi fighter Yitzhak Shamir, who would later become Israel's 7th premier, chose the name Michael as his nom de guerre after the Irish Republican Army leader Michael Collins. Now, few factors explain this popularity of the Irish model among the Zionist revisionists beyond the growing mistrust of British mandatory authorities. First, with the passing of the Italian racial laws in 1938, it no longer was possible for Zionist radicals to continue supporting Mussolini's experiment and see it as a viable model for Palestine. So the Irish resistance model, in other words, became increasingly attractive because too many of the other anti-British sentiments and programs lend themselves or collapse completely into support of the Germano-Italian axis. Second, Partition pushed the revisionists, who were already upset as early as 1920 by the separation of Transjordan from Palestine, to discard earlier federal or confederal ideas concerning a possible cantonization of Palestine in favor of a vision of a greater land of Israel, consisting of two banks of River Jordan. Not entirely consistent, some of these radicals imagined this land as a, quote, republic, but many others preferred using the opaque term Malchut, literally kingdom, which made first appearances in the poetry of Uri Tzvi Greenberg, Achimeir and Yevin's close comrade. And the term Malchut is vital in the context of our discussion here because it harks back to a glorious days of antiquity before the destruction of the Second Temple by the Roman Empire, who were, of course, in that volatile context, a stand-in for the British Empire. But third, and not less important, is the fact that partition included a crucial element that the revisionists at this stage rejected radically, which is the forced repopulation of ethno-religious minority groups to create a homogeneous state. And this is where the pamphlet you see before you, reproduced on the slide from 1973, becomes important. It was written by Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky, and it radically rejected Lord Peel's partition proposal. Crucially, Jabotinsky was acutely aware that the base of his support was among East European and predominantly Polish Jews who lived in post-1919 in the independent Second Republic of Poland under the grace of the minority treaties. And Jabotinsky rejected the plan proposed by the British, not only due to the borders it imposed in the Middle East, but also because he understood very well that the implication of toying with such ideas as minority removals would have disastrous consequences in Eastern and Central European setting on the Jews themselves. This led him also to what may have seen as a surprise conclusion, a categorical rejection of the transfer that he tied with the Greco-Turkish precedent of 1923. And the pamphlet states very boldly that the chatter regarding transfer of Arabs that you will find in the Peel Commission report is even more irresponsible from a Jewish point of view. And this is where the Royal Commission babbles on precedents that we witness are with horror, and so on and so forth. Due to time brevity, I will just mention very quickly, there are several things that a longer discussion requires, and we won't be able to do here. And in the more extended version of this paper, we hope to include several of those additional elements that I'll only allude to very quickly. First, we need to add to the equation the story of Rabbi Isaac Halevi Herzog, the first chief rabbi of Ireland from 1921 to 1936, and by the way, the grandfather of the current Israeli president, who also trotted this very sensitive Anglo-Irish Jewish terrain with caution, but began developing ideas about a Jewish theocracy as he was still in Ireland before moving to Palestine. Second, we don't have the time to discuss Robert Briscoe, the famous Jewish-Irish politician and perhaps the only Jew in the IRA, who befriended Vladimir Jabotinsky and boasted in his autobiography that he appointed himself, I quote, to a full professorship with the chair in subversive activity against England. Third, we must remember that our story becomes transnational in another sense, as Irish diaspora communities in the US and Zionist activists in America came in contact with each other. The case of Paul Dwyer, the prominent Irish-born lawyer, political activist, and the younger brother of New York City's Mayor William Dwyer, comes to mind here, especially since he was in touch with the delegation of Maximist Zionist activists, which included Arie Jabotinsky's son, who campaigned in the US in 1946, demanding to form a Jewish army in Palestine and calling for the end of the British mandate. And in oral testimony that he gave in later years, an excerpt you can see here, Dwyer did not hide the fact that he sometimes had problems digesting their ideology, but was convinced that in such times, the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend. We would like to end our presentation with an open-ended question. What do we learn from these stories? In her critically acclaimed Legacy of Violence, historian Carolyn Elkins highlighted the ways in which violence was practiced across the empire and was the most salient factor underwriting imperial identity and policies. So following her lead, we know that Ireland, as well as in Palestine, partition emerged against a background of imperial violence and simultaneously part of a broader post-war experimentation, as we just heard, with sovereignty by imperial powers between Versailles and Lausanne. We see that what the organizers of this conference dubbed the partition machine in action. But what do these stories tell us concerning the use of historical analogies in political action? Any type of historical comparison is, to a certain degree, a false analogy, since each historical case is unique. However, before we cry out false analogies or dismiss the similarity as insignificant or false, as in the famous "don't compare apples to oranges" dictum, we should acknowledge how historical actors used analogies and how such analogies shape their analysis and action. It was claimed more than once that the imperial policymaker, well versed in the chronicles of ancient empires, turned to these histories in search of guidance, or alternatively to gain lessons from they should learn from past mistakes. As a group of political scientists who looked at the almost obsessive preoccupation of British imperial thinkers with the rise and fall of the ancient Rome put it, political actors and analysis, particularly in politically challenging situations, resort to historical analogies and comparisons, not merely to impress or to underpin their arguments, but also to reduce the complexity and seeming exceptionality of political conundrums. So such analogies are not the privileged realm of the imperial elite alone, whether in the metropole or in the colonies, erudite as they may be, thanks to Oxbridge classicist training. The language of anti-colonialism and the resistance to partition also relied heavily on analogies and comparisons. Taking place a short time before the Greco-Turkish population exchange in 1923, Ireland fed into two radically modes of thinking. On the one hand, Irish partition offered a precedent to a new kind of border and state making that sought to appease growing nationalist fervor while keeping the new states within the British Commonwealth. On the other hand, rebellious Ireland was understood and approached from that perspective, as well as anti-British actors sought to find a political precedent or historical lesson to guide them forward. And each had its own Irish model or template. And the collision between them was not only a matter of genteel deliberations between intellectuals in elegantly furnished meeting rooms, but material from which much blood was spilled. Thank you.
Thank you very much to you both. And congratulations in particular on integrating stiff little fingers into your presentation. We'll pass on now to Akhila Yechury from the University of St. Andrews. Akhila is a colleague, an historian of French colonialism in India during the 19th and 20th century. So her work explores the formation of regional and national identities in colonial and post-colonial India. She's at the moment part of a research network entitled Narratives of Migration and Exchange, a interdisciplinary research project involving colleagues from St. Andrews, Presidency University, Kolkata, which investigates networks of exchange, people, ideas, technologies, and capital to mark the colonial legacy of India and Europe. Akhila, the floor is yours. Be grateful if you could keep to 15, 20 minutes and no more. We're going to run up against time. Thank you.
I will try my best. I'm going to stand if that's all right. Always useful to have a podium to rest things on and hide behind. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jay, for inviting me to do the conference. And I want to start by confessing that I feel like I'm becoming the local here. Even though I've been part of that network on migration and partitions and exchanges, I don't really work on partitions. I am a historian of French India, But at the same time, when Jay brought the idea of this conference to me, I just found it really exciting, and I wanted to be in the room, so I somehow figured out a way of being here. I will also say that I found engaging with some of the literature on partitions more globally quite instructive for my own work. But again, I've come to this conference as a bit of an outsider, so I'll ask for your indulgence here. I am, however, a historian of borders and borderlands, and French India in particular, and I'm hoping that that is of some relevance to our conversation here. In my work in general, I argue for French India to be seen as an imperial borderland, where many of the tensions of empire played themselves out over the course of a century and a half. And it is this perspective that I am bringing to the conference today. I will talk to you about a border that was created as a means of imperial management, but that then goes on to acquire a life of its own. The border, as you will see, is behind me or in multiple places. That's the full extent of my PowerPoint, so hopefully it'll just stay stable there. In talking about this border, I will highlight, perhaps might be the obvious, that borders become, irrespective of how and why they were conceptualized, living entities. And even when what they impose are haphazard, unthought through divisions, though of course much of the discussion over the course of the next 2 days will reveal that this unthought is something that we perhaps need to think through further. The ways in which these borders are crossed reveal as much about the entities they create as the lines that bind them. So this paper then is essentially about a border, as you can see on the map, which the British government in India was trying to control and manage at the same time when many of these other conversations about partitions that we'll talk about over the next day or two were taking place. More than their strategy of management, I am today going to talk about the ways in which these borders are crossed and how that can be part of our conversation. So when Jay originally asked me to talk about divisions, enclosures, or what partitions might mean for French India, it made me wonder whether it might be insightful to use the framework of partition to understand the construction of this frontier in the first place. Now, I'm aware that my fellow panelists have argued elsewhere for partition to be a concept and an imperial political strategy that is firmly grounded and rooted in the 20th century. At the same time, I do think it might be interesting for us today to go back to a different moment of international treaty making. And here I was really glad to hear Linda Sluga go back to 1815, because that's a bit of what I myself am going to do here, and talk about what she has called a moment when the international order was invented. So I am going to take us back to the Treaty of Paris of 1814, when this particular frontier that I'm going to talk about was created, and reflect on the motivations that create this space. Now, historians of French India would argue that the origins of French India lie in the first concessions that were granted to the French East India Company in the 17th century, a story that runs parallel to the successes of the English East India Company in India. I, however, argue that French India as a political entity is created in 1814 by a process one could potentially describe as an act of partitioning. After the Napoleonic Wars, the definitive Treaty of Peace was signed in Paris on the 30th of May in 1814, and it returned to France, and I'm quoting from the treaty, so excuse the convoluted language. The colonies, fisheries, factories, and establishments of every kind which were possessed by France on 1st of January, 1792. France's territories in India fell within this remit. The treaty therefore limited the extent of French colonies in India to 5 comptoirs of Pondicherry, Karaikal, Chandernagor, Mahe, and Yana, and 10 loges. Apt time for that to disappear, but as you can see, so in red are marked the 5 comptoirs, and the loges are situated randomly, but they're very, 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 very bits of land. The comptoirs were the 5 main French factories which had expanded into small settlements prior to 1763. They were as far apart as Bengal, Madras, and Malabar, as you can see, and together made up approximately 203 square miles of territory. The Loge was smaller still. There were tiny plots of land in different British-administered towns and cities. And the debates around Loge and who has control and order over these territories make for fascinating diplomatic history, but not I'm going to go into right now. Pondicherry was the largest French settlement and consequently the administrative and political center of French India. But Pondicherry itself, as you can see from the map, was not a contiguous territory. Its boundary was disjointed and irregular. In 1912, Maurice Violette, then the député of Eure-et-Loire, but later the Minister of State for the Popular Front, highlighted French frustration about these borders by simply describing the terrain of the main road in Pondicherry that ran perpendicular to the sea. And this is what the road looked like, according to him. The first 5 kilometers of this road ran through French territory, followed by 1 kilometer through British territory, and then again 3 kilometers through French territory. And so it continued for 25 whole kilometers of the road, including certain parts where it was not entirely clear whether the territories belonged to the French or to the British. Now, it can be argued that this shape of French India was an accidental consequence of the wording of a treaty agreed in Europe, in that the creation of this border would be no different from arbitrary lines drawn by imperial powers. While these lines, the precise location might be arbitrary, I want to argue that the shape of this border was also a reflection of its local political context. The unusual configuration of French territory emerged in the political context of late 18th century India. This period was dominated by conflict both between major imperial powers and with Indian rulers. This political context often played itself out through proxy wars with Indian rulers such as the Karnataka wars of the mid-18th century. Even though by the time of the 19th century, the French presence in India had already contracted to the size it would remain for the next 150 years, British anxieties about the French persisted, especially in the context of a global Franco-British rivalry. Thus, while the practical ramifications of 18th century territorial disputes soon evaporated after 1814, their memories persevered. Consequently, British officials in India, reflecting on the ramifications of these words on the ground, didn't necessarily think this configuration was a bad idea. The English East India Company, for instance, was relieved, or the officials were relieved that the French power in India was going to be curtailed as a result of this arrangement, especially since the French were now prohibited from establishing military presence or fortifying their settlements. A disjointed romp that was difficult to administer seemed like a good solution indeed to the British at this point. In conserving the French settlement in their disaggregated form, the British intended to secure their dominance over the subcontinent and prevent the French from regrouping their forces in India. The memory of Dupleix and his successors was still alive long after that period. So the EEIC hoped that by weakening the French settlements and making them into little more than tiny specks inside a vast British Empire, they would render them harmless. Rather than an accident then, it was a very conscious fashion of the frontier, shaped by the desire to keep its enemy divided. What the British in India, however, didn't take into account was that what they were creating in this process was an irregular international border in the heart of their empire in India. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. It is here that perhaps one can make a second parallel with the idea of partition. It is a strategy that rests on a concept of separation, and to an extent segregation. But this act simultaneously creates borders that need to be managed, and borders don't function according to the brief that the states constitute. Often they require a life of their own, and in the case of French India, over the course of the following century and a half, rather than offering relief, the border would come to pose a threat to quote-unquote internal security of British India. Here, I use the word internal security from British Government of India files. If one only read their correspondence in isolation, one would be led to believe that this was one of the most dangerous frontiers in the empire. What we have along this frontier then, as a consequence of this partitioned existence, is that a quote-unquote solution, keeping them disaggregated, turns into a quote-unquote problem for a changing colonial state. As I've already mentioned, what makes this particular border unique, and one that the British tried and failed to control in many, many ways, was its international character. The British government of India had no jurisdiction on the other sides of this border. And I use sides in plural because, again, look at the shape of Pondicherry. This is but an obvious fact about international borders. But within the context of British India, international borders were fairly exceptional. The other borders were with princely states, where the government of India had far greater leverage. The exception, of course, is Portuguese India, but that border was far less fragmented than this one. Because of their lack of control over French territories, the British were convinced that the French were completely inept, being a junior power in India, and full of strange political ideas after all. Correspondence of British administrators along this line is a great case study for stereotypes about the French. More relevant, though, than the imagined French ineptitude was the fact that those crossing this border were completely aware of the limits of British jurisdiction and didn't hesitate to manipulate them. Again, if I had time, I would regale you with stories of border crossing, but it has told me to keep to the limit, so I won't do that. And also, I thought we were meant to be talking about the 20th century, so I've confined my cases to the 20th century, though I would have loved to go back further. I will also only talk about the cases that generated anxiety for the British government in India. The French had their own anxieties and concerns. Many of them were articulated around the concept of sovereignty, but to talk about both of them would require much more time than I have left for this paper. So I am going to talk about crossings that cause anxiety for the government of India, the British government. One such form of crossing was smuggling. In the case of French India, the disjointed nature of the border facilitated the undetected movement of commodities across this frontier. There were multiple ways in which goods were smuggled across this border. First, and perhaps an easy method, was to take goods by train without bothering to hide them, but bribe the customs official. Second was to manually carry it, and this is quite fascinating to look at how this was done, because the border was fairly porous and not monitored continuously day and night. It was common practice for smugglers to hide their goods at a suitable place on the French side of the border, wait for the British patrol to pass, and then just simply lift them and carry them onto the other side and load them onto cars or wherever they were going to take them. The third was the sea. And as you can see, all five comptoirs, with the exception of Dubnov, share coast, or rather have a coastline, and therefore the sea was a very easy conduit into French India. From a British point of view, the ease with which smuggled goods crossed the border had serious consequences for colonial governments and their election. For a start, the proximity of the French border and the difficulty in controlling it meant that residents on the British side routinely procured their daily supplies from the other side of the border. Duty-free, very important there. More importantly, though, French India was also one of the critical entry points for goods being smuggled into British India. During the 19th century, salt and opium, both state monopolies, were frequently smuggled across the French border. By the 1930s, the French territory in South India was identified as a principal source of opium smuggled from Ceylon. The turn of the century saw two new commodities, cocaine and arms, being smuggled across the Anglo-French border in India. Smuggled cocaine, being a highly legible commodity, causes substantial loss of revenue for the government of India. But smuggled arms and ammunition, which often found their way into the hands of revolutionary terrorists, especially in Bengal, touched upon another broader, growing political relevance in India. Official British reports from the first decade of the 20th century drew a direct correlation between the rising militancy in Bengal and the increase in arms imported to Jammu, for instance. Indeed, some of the most famous instances of revolutionary violence had links with French colonial territories. For instance, the gun which shot the trooper in a high-profile Alipur bomb trial was sourced from Jammu, as were the bombs thrown at the Houses Square in Calcutta in 1911, and at Viceroy Harding in Delhi on 23rd of December 1912. Smuggling then was not just an economic problem. It also raised intractable legal problems. This was reflected both in the ways the commodity entered French India and the means by which they did so. Seaborne smuggling, as I've already said, was a method of choice, but often smugglers used ingenious methods that revealed an active knowledge of international law and an astute ability to subvert legal structures. This is best revealed in the use of the postal network to smuggle goods into British India. I'm going to share a few examples of how this was done. I will also hopefully emphasize why talking about smuggled goods is relevant to a conference on partitions. So, going back to my cases for smuggling. In April 1908, the Bombay Post Office discovered almost 50 packages of cocaine which arrived on French mail steamers and were traveling to Dubnov. Cocaine smugglers often used a variety of original packaging methods, such as books with a cavity, hollowed out broomsticks, broom heads, or simply packages labeled shirting and nose gentleman. And each successful capture convinced the British that there was far more where this was coming from. Arms too followed a similar route. They arrived both by international mail and were very often carried by British inland mail from Pondicherry to Jammu. Such a manipulation of the postal system was only possible because this frontier was also an international border, and it came with its own treaty arrangements and privileges of which were exploited by smugglers. Both France and Britain, along with Portugal and their respective colonies, were signatories to the Parcel Post Convention of 1906, which guaranteed freedom of transit to parcels addressed to these territories, which meant that goods could travel through British territory without the British officials having the ability to check them. By 1934, the Indian Post and Telegraph Office estimated that an annual loss of revenue by the French lent was approximately 1 million rupees. I wish I could translate it to modern terms, but I'm not terribly good at that. So, smugglers, however, were not the only ones taking advantage of this legal lacuna. The postal network was used as deftly by Indian radicals to circulate arms, ammunition, and proscribed literature. Like the smugglers discussed right now, they too manipulated different legal regimes on either side of the border to escape British Indian police and jurisdiction. In 1908, for instance, Subramaniam Bharati escaped British anti-sedition laws by fleeing to Pondicherry, from where he continued to publish his nationalist Tamil weekly magazine, Indian. Soon after that, Aurobindo Ghosh followed suit, and all through the 1930s, socialists escaping from British prisons found their way to Gannon, or, like R.C.L. Sharma, accused in the Meerut conspiracy case, took refuge in Pondicherry. The British police were neither able to chase after these figures into French territories, nor were they very successful in extraditing them. The reason for this, again, is the difference between French and British laws and the application of international law in determining the relationship between both sides of the border. So, for instance, in July 1930, when in the throes of the civil disobedience movement, some nationalists moved to the French part of Balasore, where the French had a loge, in order to set up an ashram and carry out civil disobedience. The French administration was legally incapable of helping the British, despite the latter's insistence that they be allowed to go into the French loge. The reasons were twofold. Firstly, by picketing shops selling British goods or disobeying British laws, Indian nationalists were not breaking any French laws. Secondly, being political activists in the French territory, they fell into the category of political refugees and therefore were protected by international law. From smuggling to political refuge, there's an underlying theme of resistance of colonial order and legal structures. At the border, subject populations found ways of subverting these political legal regimes and continuously used differences for their own advantage. But manipulation of the border wasn't always a political act. Occasionally, these frontiers were used to settle petty personal disputes, as was the case in 1934, when the border of French Loge and Palestine again became the site for settling a local grudge between villages on either side. That year, the wife of a French subject, Ozan, ran away from home to live with her lover on the other side of the border. When Ozan tried to bring her back, he was beaten up by her lover. Persuaded by the residents of the Loge, he filed a complaint with the British authorities at Palestine. This didn't go down terribly well with the wife's lover, who went on to mobilize men from his village, not only to threaten the boy, but his entire village. Residents of the Loge now faced a blockade from the British side and were neither able to get to their animals nor to the market. This time, they complained to the French administration about the inaction of the British, and finally threatened to leave the French Loge en masse if the French did not protect the rights of their subjects. So here, as in all cases discussed above, the ease of the border crossings was juxtaposed by the rigidity of its existence. But this very existence allows for these exchanges to take place. I need to rush. I have only a page. So by 1938, the anxiety around this border was so great that the government of India commissioned a report. H. Greenfield, a civil servant and the author of this report, when describing the challenges of monitoring the border, emphasized the topography of the region, with its extensive sea frontier on one side and an easily negotiable interior border on the other. According to him, the interior border was mainly flat and dry, with excellent cover afforded by frequent casuarina plantations. This made it extremely favorable to contraband traffic. Such traffic could only be checked, he argued, if it was brought under control by a barbed wire fence, preferably reinforced by a cactus hedge. More than the execution of this plan, which was both unrealistic and way too expensive, Greenfield's rationale might be of some interest to us today. In making an argument for a barbed wire fence, Greenfield drew direct and deliberate comparisons between the need to quote-unquote secure French India and Charles Stegart's project to pacify, again, quote-unquote pacify, Palestine after the revolt of 1936. By situating French India within a broader context of imperial struggle, Greenfield and other local officials presented the French-Indian frontier as an imperial challenge that had to be surmounted. It was a way of bringing this small region into the wider debate about imperial policing and locate the challenges of this minor frontier within a wider logic of empire building in the 20th century. Indirectly referencing Steggart, Greenfield certainly sought to mobilize the French-Indian border. Mobilize the French-Indian border. This connection also demonstrates the far-ranging reach of this particular imperial rhetoric, and in using it against the French in India, it paints them, quite ironically, with the same brush as Palestinian nationalists. The problem with French India, however, was ever so slightly different. The real problem for the British was not their inability to make the frontier visible through fences and cacti, but their inability to exercise power within French territory. This was not a result of hostile terrain or anti-colonial resistance, but instead a result of imperial frontier making in the early 19th century. To put it simply, the greatest challenge to the British authority was a diplomatic frontier of French India, and those living on either sides of the border knew only too well how to manipulate it. So to finish, and not take up more time, in my paper today, I tried to show how a frontier that was deliberately preserved in its moth-eaten state, and I use the phrase deliberately, becomes a dynamic space over the course of its existence. A space that is determined as much by the ways in which it is manipulated as it is by the ways in which it is sought to be policed. In doing so, I have tried to highlight that while imperial frontiers are fashions to control, divide, and to manage, these very structures of order often become sites of disorder, and that the afterlives of these borders are shaped as much by those who live along them as they are by those who create them. The other point, and one which I haven't spent much time on today, is that these borders remained unchanged for about 150 years, despite the best efforts on both sides. And they were only resolved, one might use, if one wants to use that word, with the decolonization of South in South Asia, and a shift, at least in South Asia, from imperial to national borders. If I am to end with a question that perhaps I'm posing to the panel and in general, I think my big question here, relevant or not, is how do we incorporate these everyday histories of these borders into grander narratives of partition and state making, and how do we get them to speak to each other? Thank you.
Very much, Akhila. We'll pass very quickly on now to Ali Raza, who comes to us from Lahore University of Management in Pakistan. He is the author of Revolutionary Past, Communist Internationalism in Colonial India. It came out with CPP a couple of years ago. Welcome, Ali. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Jay, for the invitation and for the opportunity to present my recent work, my ongoing work, as my half-baked paper would have indicated, is very much in its nascent stages. To cut to the chase, I'll begin by situating my paper, my talk today, within the larger project, which is on paramilitarism in South Asia across the 20th century. And for this brief talk, I'm interested specifically in how the Interwar experiments and minority protections and minority guarantees in Europe were received in India, which at that time was grappling with its own minority question. I'm especially interested in how ultra-nationalist paramilitary movements thought about this question. These movements, by way of a brief background, typically define themselves as volunteer association, devoted to social service and societal uplift. But they were also organized along military lines, with an explicit aim of rejuvenating, disciplining, mobilizing, and militarizing their communities. One of the earliest, and certainly the best known amongst them, the Hindu nationalist Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, was founded in 1925, but other organizations across communal lines soon followed suit. Most were organized, as I mentioned, on faith-based lines, but they were also embedded within a global intellectual and political circuit of interwar fascism. And despite the many divergences and conflicts with each other, they were driven by similar ideals. Their ideas belonged to what historians and scholars have elsewhere aptly described as a fascist repertoire or a fascist catalog of ideas. And like fascist movements around the world, this catalog included ideas of ethnic, racial, communal, civilizational superiority, purity, discipline, mobilization, militarism, authoritarianism, dictatorship, social Darwinism, contempt for liberalism, hatred for Marxism, the new man, the new woman, and finally, a deeply held conviction in the redemptive promise of mass violence. Violence not merely as a means of negotiating and doing politics, but violence also as a means of ending politics. Some groups were explicitly modeled on the Italian black shirts and the Nazi paramilitary units like the Sturmabteilung and the Schutzstaffel. Mass organized violence was not simply a response to the alleged ineffectiveness, effeminacy, and weaknesses of Gandhian nonviolence as they saw it. It was also instead a force to purify the world and make it anew. Death and sacrifice were the renewers of life, the redeemers of nations. And so by the end of the interwar period, there were dozens of such groups with varying ideological leanings and hundreds of smaller offshoots across British and princely India. Together, these groups could claim hundreds and thousands of young, primarily male, upper caste recruits from all communities in all corners of the subcontinent. Viewed more expansively, paramilitarism was a much wider phenomenon in India as indeed elsewhere around the world. By the late 1930s, virtually every political and socio-religious organization had their own affiliate volunteer or paramilitary group. In that sense, at least, the paramilitary form exceeded any specific ideological feeling. Paramilitarism simply became part of what Sadiq Kaviraj, as Ulster called, the popular political imagination. And across the board, it was a means of disciplining, mobilizing, serving, and defending communities with a view of attaining power, sovereignty, and dominance in the aftermath of empire. Put simply, these movements position themselves as states and nations in waiting. And in case you're wondering, those guys are carrying spades because they were not allowed to carry rifles or swords. And these cannons don't work. But that could give you a sense, I hope, of what this paramilitarism is that I'm trying to talk about. But I want to focus on two figures specifically today. The first man on my left, Madhav Golwalkar, the second leader and the longest serving leader, and then indeed the formative leader of the RSS, and his counterpart at the time, Inayatullah Khan Mashriqi, the founder and the lifelong leader of the Khalsa Tahreek, which in the interwar period is the most prominent and powerful Muslim paramilitary organization in India. And what interests me both is their interest in the minority question in Europe and its attempted resolution over there. They're clearly following the League of Nations minority protection systems that are introduced in the post-war settlement, and in particular, in this provision that of which, of course, the Treaty of Ozan was a part of, and in particular in this proviso that the minority protection treaties offered minorities, which gave them the right to establish and control religious and social institutions, schools, to use their own language, to exercise their own religion, and so on. Golwalkar has a lot to say about the League of Nations systems that are introduced on minorities. His famed text, "We Are Nationhood Defined," talks a lot about the League of Nations definition of what constitutes a nation, which, as he sees, corresponds with his definition of a nation, which included those five indivisible wholes, in some ways, those units that constituted one whole, those five constituent units being country, race, religion, culture, and language, which he saw as a scientific definition of a nation, which he claimed was very much aligned with the League of Nations emphasis on what constituted a people, and in particular emphasis on race, language, and religion. And of course, his definition of that nation corresponds with the Hindu nation, well, by extension, Muslims could only exist as subject peoples in the land of Hindustan. And so in thinking about the joint Muslim and minority question, it's interesting to me how Golwalkar turns to the precedent established by these minority treaties, and in particular, their failure. And I want to focus on one particular failure here today, which was, as they saw it, the failure of Czechoslovakia. Both the creation of it, obviously being closely supervised by the victorious powers, and the management in some ways of the minority that were cobbled together in that state, and their supervision by the League of Nations. The Czech state, Golwalkar wrote, despite the most scrupulous care taken to bring about harmony, in spite of the vigilance of the League of Nations, all unnational elements have fallen out and justified the fears of heaping together into one state elements that conflict with the national life. He is writing in 1938, which is when the Sudeten land question and the question of Sudeten Germans is very much on the horizon, and which triggers off the Second World War, of course. But the conclusion that he's drawing from the failure of the Czech experiment, as he puts it, is that the existence of minorities, quote, in the sense of persons with the right to the protection of the League of Nations, is impossible. In that sense, a worthy contrast for him is offered by the old nations, effectively the victorious powers, specifically the United States and Britain, because where he claims adequate provisions have been introduced to solving the minorities problem. Because none of these nations, as Golwalkar points out, recognized any minorities within the polity. They simply did not exist, legally speaking. Immigrants had to get themselves naturally assimilated in the principal mass of population, the national race, by adopting its culture and language and sharing in its aspirations, by losing all consciousness of their separate existence and thereby forgetting their foreign origin. And if they did not do so, he added, they lived merely as outsiders, bound by all the codes and conventions of the nation, on the sufferance of the nation, and deserving of no special protection, far less any privilege or rights. That alone, he added, could keep the national life healthy and undisturbed. And so the lesson, in other words, for Muslims in India was straightforward. They could not expect any special protections as the minority treaties envisioned. Instead, the foreign races of Hindustan, which included primarily Muslims and Christians, must either adopt a Hindu culture and language, must learn to respect and hold in reverence Hindu religion, must entertain no idea but those of the glorification of the Hindu race and culture, and they must stay, I'm skipping ahead, wholly subordinate to the Hindu nation, claiming nothing, deserving no privileges, far less any preferential treatment, not even, he adds, citizens' rights. And there is that point in the text where he compares the resolution to the Muslim problem in India with the way that the Nazis are resolving the Jewish question in Germany. And so Czechoslovakia then was a warning to India. If implemented, it could shatter, he said, Hindu national life. And what is interesting to me is how his rejection of those interwar treaties on minority protection was shared by this other individual on the screen, Inayatullah Khan Mashriqi, born in 1888, founder of the Khalsa Tahrik, which, as I mentioned, was the most prominent Muslim paramilitary group in the interwar era, and most of Mashriqi's worldview and ideas are set forth in his first landmark book called the Tazkara, which was an exegesis of the Quran, which he claimed was qualitatively superior to Mein Kampf and was in fact the inspiration behind National Socialism in Germany. It's in Tazkara that Mashriqi outlines his view of what dictates and creates history, which simply speaking, is a struggle between nations. It is, in other words, a story of the survival of the fittest, a phrase that he uses time and again. And so the key to resuscitating a declining Muslim people and civilization was to revive its glorious traditions of militarism and dominance. And so like the RSS, from its inception then, the Tahrik, founded in 1931, is a paramilitary group dedicated to strengthening and regenerating the Muslim nation through militaristic exercises and preparation. And the images that I showed you are all of Khalsars marching through the streets across India. Because they're lesser known than the more familiar images that we have of RSS cadres who still march in the streets of India today. He also claimed to be the first Sipahi of the soldier of the movement, and his claim, the Khalsar claim, in other words, I'm skipping ahead again now, he claimed that the right to dominate, to govern, and to rule India could only be claimed by having a history of having conquered it, as Muslims had in the past. Put differently, only a martial people willing to expend their blood and spill others' blood had the historic right of rule, a lesson imparted by the colonial rule itself. I'll come back to that in a bit. But Khoon, or blood, the Khoon, the Hindi-Urdu equivalent of blood, commanded a three-layered meaning, as indeed it does in English too, as sacrifice, as killing, and as kinship. A people's Khoon, in other words, could only be replenished, strengthened, reinvigorated by a sacrificial offering of their own, which came from a willingness to shed in other people's own. That's the worldview that I am interested in. And crucially, this made the minorities question in India entirely relevant. And amongst Muslim organizations, this is a huge question of the time. Faisal Devji, for example, speaks about how the failure of the mandate system and the minority protection system shapes the political imagination of the Muslim League, and thereby also partially creates this demand for Pakistan. And the Khalsars too are determined in many ways to avoid both the designation and the fate of being a minority. And so this worldview in some ways completely avoids the minorities problem altogether. Because given because the route out of minority status lay in determining which nation was best placed to play, as Masriki put it, the game of blood. Only the Muslims, he added, had historically demonstrated the martial legacies and abilities. This was not just the principle that applied in India. Instead, it was the history of the world itself. The lesson, in fact, that he drew was quite the opposite. And the lesson was simple, that in fact, it was minorities that had historically ruled the world. Discipline, ironclad commitment, military prowess, and above all, a willingness to kill and be killed was more than sufficient to overpower any claim that may come from greater numbers alone, which was the threat that democracy posed, in other words. Might quite literally determined right. And that, after all, was a paramount lesson Europe itself had given to the world through its global conquests. And it was also a lesson that was implicitly and explicitly imparted in every account that colonial historians ever wrote about the conquest of India, from James Mill's History of India to Risley's Peoples of India. And this was also why Masriki repeatedly cited the English example in his speeches and writings. And it is striking just how often these comparisons come up in not just the writings of Masriki, but also Goldberger and other ideologues at the time, including, of course, the extermination of native peoples in the United States, in Australia, and elsewhere. Minorities and majorities and their associated facile protections or guarantees are irrelevant then, since this question could only be decided in the course of struggle. And there are affiliated thinkers who also reject, with Masriki, who reject, I'm skipping ahead now, who reject the Czechoslovakian experiment, because in Czechoslovakia, with the oppression, with the alleged oppression at least, of the Sudeten Germans, they see evident proof of how these multi-ethnic nation states and the status of minorities within them simply cannot work. They simply cannot be guaranteed or ensured. And so if Muslims were to avoid living as a subject people, and in other words, to avoid the fate of eventual extermination, at the very least, that meant that they would have to live separately from their Hindu neighbors. And this was an early warning of what would eventually occur a mere 9 years later. I won't go into an extended conclusion. I'll just end on what Professor Glindas Luga drew our attention to, those militias during partition. This is what these militias look like. By 1947, by the spring of 1947, according to this chart, there are at least 500,000 men, trained men, who were part of these 12 major militias, as I've mentioned, as this chart mentions, operating in British India. This is only British India. It does not include princely India, by which we can conclude that the number of 500,000 was a radical underestimate. Another way of contextualizing this figure is to think about this number as being a number that dwarfs this rapidly demobilizing British Indian Army after the Second World War. And part of the violence of partition is orchestrated, instigated, spearheaded by these very groups, whose imagination, as I've tried to argue in this talk and the extended paper, is shaped by the failure of those minority protection systems that are introduced in interwar Europe. Finally, on a concluding note, Sudetenland doesn't just come up in the interwar period. It also becomes important in the post-war settlement after the Second World War, in the Potsdam Conference, and specifically in the expulsion of ethnic Germans following 1945. And that too is followed with great interest, because what was long imagined in terms of transferring populations, in terms of thinking of surplus populations, is now a concrete possibility. And so part of what I'm interested in is thinking about how that expulsion of ethnic Germans that follows the Second World War is in part the logic that governs in some ways, expulsion of surplus populations on either side in India and Pakistan in 1947. And I think I'll end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arie. And we'll move quickly on now to some brief comments by Ozan Ozavci, who's assistant professor of Imperial history at Utrecht University and co-convener of the Lausanne project, as well as the Security History Network.
Yes, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Jay, in the first place, for your kind invitation. And I apologize for not being able to attend in person. I was really looking forward to meeting many of you there, but last minute emergency prevented me from coming to Glasgow. I think I should be very quick, right? Because we don't have much time. So maybe I will just make it as short as possible. All three papers were very interesting. I really enjoyed listening to the presentations. I could read only Arie Raza's paper, since the other two were not, I couldn't find them on the shared drive. So I'm going to make some very general remarks on these papers. And I think this is good news in a sense, because I will set the bar really low for later commentators so they can just capitalize on that in the coming days. So Arie Raza's presentation discusses how the League of Nations system and its insufficiency of minority protections shaped political imaginations in colonial India, and how Indian ultra-nationalist paramilitary groups looked to the example of Czechoslovakia as an object lesson as to why coexistence of minorities and majorities was extremely problematic and difficult, and at times inviting of drastic measures that might go to such lengths as extreme violence. I find it very interesting that he was discussing these ultranationalist groups appear to conceive of minority safeguards and assurances as pathways to separatism and secessionism, because they considered coexistence and equality before law as naive ideals. So in a way, the failure of the League of Nations to ensure guarantees for the minorities and the suspicious visions of the nationalist groups in this part of the world, in India, actually speak to each other within the framework of in ultranationalism, foreign interventionism, or international law. And I believe it makes heeding the origins of minority rights protection through interferences in international law particularly important to the storyline Arie offers us, especially in the paper that he submitted, or his presentation focused more on the paramilitary groups, which was fascinating. And another fascinating point he underscores is the fact that those powers that considered themselves situated in the privileged end of the so-called stand of civilization did not view minority protections as applicable to them. So I think the connection between the three papers can be drawn perhaps in these trans-imperial links in terms of borders and local responses to them. And as a trans-imperial historian and historian of foreign interventions in the so-called Middle East and North Africa, I must say I find Arie's postulations very familiar, especially in the fabric of the so-called Eastern question, which was conceived first as a question of how to deal with the alleged perceived weakness of the Ottoman Empire, and then as a question of, to cite Alexis de Tocqueville, how to tame the fallen beast that was Asia or the entire Oriental world. In these accounts, we find this peculiar history of minority rights protection. And I wasn't able to follow her speech, but I believe Glenda might have also mentioned the 1815 Congress of Vienna, where Russian Tsar Alexander was proposing the protection of the Serbians as minorities from the despotic rule of the Ottomans by providing them with a degree of autonomy. And in 1842, we would see this one of the first, if not the first moment of partition in the Middle East, when Lebanon was cut in half by the intervening self-ascribed great powers, Austria, Britain, Prussia, Russia, and France, to prevent the warring Druze and Maronites to further their conflicts. So the term minorities were propounded possibly for the first time in the Ottoman Levant in this context, and in relation to the Maronite villages that remained in the Druze district. There were several other moments of partition, the desire to protect the minorities, mainly Christian minorities, and safeguarding, ensuring safeguards by ways of armed interventions in late Ottoman history, as we saw in the intervention in Greece, Egypt, Lebanon, what have you. And I tell you all this, not simply because I want to point to the fact that we might understand dynamics of partition and its genealogies, not only in the immediate context of the 20th century, but also we might like to see how rising nationalisms in different parts of the world speak or look back to this past, as we can see very lucidly in the case of Turkish delegation at Lausanne, who were like defensively ultra-nationalist and extremely averse to the ideas of coexistence and diversity. And they shared, I would say, to a considerable extent, the anxieties of the very nationalist groups in India that Arie was speaking of. So here they looked not at Czechoslovakia, but to their recent past, these Turkish nationalists, and reconstructed it time and time again. And at Lausanne, also, they were reconstructing this past of interventions and this nationalist backlash. Though, of course, they would skip drastic imperial moments like the Armenian genocide. So my question to Ali would be as to whether in India there was any awareness of this, Ottoman experience with foreign interventions, partitions, and responses to it. Because from an Ottoman imperial perspective, and eventual Turkish nationalist perspective, you could find this exact same discourse as the Indian ultra-nationalists a decade later, how partitionism and minority rights would lead to secessionism and separatism. And that was one of the reasons, I would say, why at Lausanne they wanted to prevent any channel of interventions in the affairs of the new Turkey. Or were there any? Could you see any bridges between? And I'm also curious how a minority was defined and conceptualized by these ultranationalists. Like, what did they mean by it, and how do you conceptualize it? Like, as a religious identity, as was the case at Lausanne, or were there any particularities that you might like to speak of?
Thanks very much, Ozan. I think we'll probably allow Ali a moment to very quickly respond to you, and then have a couple of minutes for the audience who've been sitting patiently through, in case there are any questions from the audience, and I'm sure there will be. Ali?
Very briefly, do I have to speak into the mic? Thank you so much for those comments. Very briefly, yes, they are the Ottoman kind of experience and the Treaty of Lausanne specifically are models that are being followed closely, especially in the 1920s, obviously, as you can imagine. And they also form the basis for what another key thinker, foundational thinker for Pakistan, Chaudhry Rahmat Ali, came up with in his formulations on what this independent state could be. Regarding the understanding of what a minority is in some ways, which I find to be a very interesting question when it comes to these groups, that definition of a minority effectively takes off from this colonial understanding of what a minority is, which in some ways is a demographic, is based on numbers alone, but more crucially, in the colonial scheme of things, that number is also then added on to a given community's historical importance. So which is where the Muslim question becomes important in India, which is to say that this is not just merely a number, it's also a community that has historically been important to the course of Indian history. And so in that sense, the minority question in India is considerably more complicated in terms of who deserves what kind of privileges and so on. So those privileges ought to be determined in this view, not just based on numbers alone, but also to a community's historical importance. I think I'll leave it there, but I'm only pointing it out to say that the question is considerably more complicated than what numbers would suggest.
Thank you very much. And now I'll turn it over to the audience for about 12 minutes of questions. Can I ask you to restrain yourselves to asking one question only and asking a question rather than making a pronunciamiento of some kind, because we are kind of stretched for time. So over to you. Glenda.
I have a question about the lodge. What they represent, because I know, you know, is it a useful kind of concept for thinking about sovereign alternative sovereignty?
Thank you. Is it?
I don't know.
That's a really interesting question, and I could really talk for hours about these laws because they're effectively only tiny bits of property. Sometimes it would be the size of, you know, this building. Oh, that's bit of property. Oh, okay, sorry, but microphones. But they provoke the most intense conversations and debates and discussions about sovereignty in terms of who has sovereignty over these spaces and therefore who has legal jurisdiction over these spaces. And for about 150 years, the British and the French just constantly go at each other, trying to define these spaces and trying to define their terms of control. And the most amazing thing is that they never arrive at any conclusion. And they almost arrive at agreements, and then they just back off because either someone's calculated the value of the property inadequately, or they feel that a particular request by the British infringes on French sovereignty. And so these laws become this fascinating insight into 19th century debates about sovereignty that are playing out across the empire. So I could go on, but I will stop.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions online. Could you please read the first one, Jay?
All right, great. So we have the first question from Catherine Smith, who would like to basically, I think it's a question for the panel. We saw the shift in mindset from the 18th century to the 19th century, the 21st century, in terms of European colonies' recognition of Indian powers. I think the question for the two of you working on South Asia, do you think there's a shift in mindset in terms of 18th to the 19th, the 20th century, where European colonies' recognition by Indian powers as useful trading partners and not full sovereignties? I thought I could paraphrase it. I should have just read it.
Which of you would like to tackle that?
Let me just try again. Okay, no, this is actually for you, Akhila. We're not early 19th century European treaty writers implicitly predicated by 18th century mindset European colonies' recognition by Indian powers as useful trading partners, not local full sovereignties. Question. By 20th century, there was no such mindset still in existence. How much do you think such fundamental shift in mindset affected the thinking in later local relationships?
Right, so I am going to answer what I have understood the question to be about changing norms of treaty agreements and whether the context in which early 19th century treaties are formulated and agreed translate across that time and into the 20th century and what the implications of that might be.
I think it's a question of inequality, the perceptions of inequality over time across centuries.
So I think what I'd argue is that more than inequality in terms of international treaty making and looking at imperial context, the concerns of towards the earlier bit of the 19th century was more management. And in India in particular, there were a lot of treaties that were being sort of discussed, argued, and signed between various local rulers and the English East India Company, for instance. And perhaps that's the context of this question, that there was an inequality predicated or sort of worked into these agreements where the English East India Company was always the more powerful entity. And in some ways, the discourse of that inequality plays itself into the ways in which the French are understood in this period, but the French are not Indian princes, and the French are European entity in India. So what you have in this particular context is a particular discourse and debate, a language that constantly permeates these interactions, which the French consistently fight against and resist. And they have the ability to resist because they have equal standing in an imagined international order.
Thank you. We have another question. This is by a colleague, many of us know, Raza, from joining us from Delhi. This would be a question from Ali because we're anti-colonial activists. And she wants to know that she has a question about idea of civilization and empire as conceptualized by anti-colonial activists. Do you feel that these in turn were also informed by imperial methods of defining geography? The idea of Indian civilization takes hold partly as a consequence of British methods of mapping. How does perhaps this relate to, this notion of regeneration and revivalism that you're talking about in the paper?
I mean, I think, again, from what I've understood of the question, and specifically in relation to the groups that I spoke about, I think in some ways it sets a template for thinking about history at large and what makes history and what the course of human history has been. Which is why these imperial histories, I know I'm not directly addressing the geography question, but in some ways, what the history of empire is for these groups is effectively a history of struggle, and how that struggle becomes, of course, world history. And so in that sense, I guess those imperial examples become important for the individuals that I mentioned and the groups that I'm talking about. Not really a good answer to a question that I have to think more about, but I think I'll keep it to this.
Thank you. Thank
Can
you.
I quickly comment on that question, though, please?
Quickly.
Very quickly, which is that but the kind of imagined geographies that Pallavi is talking about do play a role in the decolonization of the French settlements, for instance, and the fact that it's absorbed into British India has very much to do with the imagined geographies of the Indian nation and what the frontiers of this nation ought to look like. So that this sort of imagery definitely feeds into how these spaces are understood at different points.
Thank you. Thank you. I have a question here.
Very quick question.
Thank you to all the presenters. Really difficult topics, thorny, complicated, makes for great learning and conversation. My question, what I'm struggling with, it came out, I think, very strongly in Ali's paper, but it isn't actually in all the resets. And that is, there's a dark message, I don't know what to call it, that is being presented in the 20s and 30s. And our discussant, Ozan, drew some interesting parallels. You could draw between, I would extend, you could link in some ways Jabotinsky's Turkish nationalists, ultra-Turkish nationalists, certain segments that you don't see coexistence at all as a possibility or even bothered. And then Mashraqi's message and another, etc. And I was thinking with some of my students would call this is a call for a Game of Thrones world. That's essentially what it is, whether we like it or not. We can see where it's coming from, the cynicism from Partitions to draw to our theme. But I was just wondering, what was the pushback against this from their opponents, not colonialists, but others? Obviously, there are so many. Gandhi would rise as a prominent example, but there's so many more that would say, well, we're not going to agree with that either, because we're going to lose the moral ground, higher ground, which came out so strongly in the Ireland and Palestine paper. So I just want to, I wanted to close with observation that the numbers you cited, Arie, are not inconsequential. And this is what's really different from, like, let's say, extremist groups today on the internet and so forth, that are tiny in comparison to the numbers that you cited. And is it the atomic bomb, for example, that changed things and said we cannot have that kind of dark message anymore? That's one theory I had that might have said put that dark message to rest, but of course came after this time that you're mentioning.
Thank you.
We are really connect questions. Connor has one, and then
Okay.
Raza.
Last question.
Thanks, I'll keep it short. It relates to Alie's paper, but my director, Darragh and Arie. Again, this is kind of on the genealogies and the transfer of ideas. It was interesting that you said P.S. O'Hegarty and how he's translated into Hebrew and Colin Navdiger. But the thing that I think links all this is really veteranship. To what extent is the training of people in arms in the First World War, the Irish case in the Boer War, obviously sepoys in India, how influential are veterans of all fields in actually coming home and then creating or leading these paramilitary and revolutionary movements? So that's the question.
There's another question.
I think probably that we'll also turn over to our colleagues online, see if they have a response to that question as well, which is an interesting one.
I'll keep this very short, but veterans are a huge part of this paramilitary matrix of sorts, both after the First World War, but especially after the Second World War. The very militias that I showed, they were trained after the war by demobilized soldiers, not just in the regular British Indian Army, but also from the Indian National Army, who also participate in ethnic cleansing and mass killing, especially Punjab, which is a paper by Wilkinson and George showed, was strongly concentrated in areas where military recruitment was at its highest. And it's not just that, but weapons from the Burma front, and especially captured Japanese weapons and leftover American weapons are used on civilian populations in 1947 on both borders. That's the first answer to the question. The second, numbers, thank you for mentioning that. I really appreciate it. Those numbers for me made these ideas far more darker and darker still. They made them far more consequential. And instead of being some fancy ideas that one studies out of academic curiosity, they became more concrete and they became more fearsome in some ways. These are numbers that have been increasing over the course of the Second World War, especially. On average, all the organizations that I showed, they increased the numbers sixfold over the course of those 5 years for various reasons that I won't get into now. But and part of what I'm trying to think about is how a global war against fascism strengthened fascism in India. And there's a paradox that I'm interested in some ways, because many of these groups are actually preparing for what they view to be an inevitable civil conflict and civil war in the departure and the wake of empire. And that's ultimately what they're preparing for, which explains those numbers that we saw in the spring of 1947, which, as I said, are radical underestimate. There were other points, but I would love to discuss them in the break that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just very, very quickly, turning over to our first paper givers to see if they have any very quick observations in response to what's been said in the questions.
I'll jump in very quickly, and I've heard the questions abruptly. Not very well, but I will say I will comment on the extreme Zionist angle and the debates there. I think that part of the questions put the finger on some sort of a double-edged sword element or dynamic that you have there among these members who are, on the one hand, see themselves as a minority. So the opposition coming from within the Zionist movement, that the mainstream was to go with the British Empire, is that it's not only a risky way of losing the empire, which is an engine for a nation building project, but also that it's kind of a useless and it will end in a bloodshed. But it often was kind of the assumption that the League of Nations and the empire would be sort of a not only a source of oppression, not a source of oppression as much as the thing that would defend Jews as a minority. And part of the argument I would be making on the Jewish case is that we need to understand it is a minority nationalism that works very differently from majoritarian groups that are working with the nationalist movement with nationalist ideas. I will keep it at this telegraphic element dimension.
Thank you very much. And
very briefly, if I could just very briefly, just for one moment, just to chime in, in relation to the question about civilization earlier, which I think came up in the context of India, I think some of the papers heard this morning more broadly speak to this idea of scripting partition, scripting revolution, in which stakeholders, as well as anti-colonial nationalists, use terms like civilization to, force legitimacy of their claims and so on. So I think that's an interesting dialectic. And just I think to the last two questions, which spoke to both the dark message emerging out of the papers this morning and the idea of paramilitarism, I just think this conversation is incredibly important, not only in terms of the empirical case studies, which we are studying individually, but also to this idea of the futures of global history, the futures of transnational history, that it's not necessarily a benign study into the benign agents of the past, but actually this idea of the dark side of transnationalism, as Kieran Klaus Patel has suggested. So I think those papers together speak to that moment in transnational history more broadly.
Thanks very much. Thank you. And thank all of you for listening, and thanks especially to our panelists, all four. They were three superb and important papers, and I'm very pleased that we've opened this excellent conference with such high quality. So congratulations.